He learned combat skills by following online videos, went to a shooting range to learn shooting, and then exercised with fitness equipment. This monotonous life, the man has persisted for a year. When the time was ripe, he bought a sports car and modified it for reinforcement. Then he purchased a large amount of weapons from the black market. Subsequently, taking advantage of the police's inattention, he sneaked into the archives room and took photos of all the gang members. His aim was to avenge his son, who died tragically. A year ago, a man was playing with his son in the yard when he unexpectedly encountered a gang fight. Bullets rained down around his yard in an instant. When the other side left, he quickly looked down and found that his son had been shot and had no breath. The once happy family was thus shattered. Jim angrily rushed to the street corner in a flash to look for the figure of the other party who had left. This time, the gangsters were still fighting on the street, and the sounds of violent collisions and gunshots kept ringing out on the street until one side was completely wiped out, ending the battle. Seeing the other party about to leave, Jim hurriedly picked up an iron rod and hid aside. When they passed by, he hit the vehicle's windshield hard. However, this not only failed to harm them, but also completely enraged them, and they shot at Jim frantically. Jim could only run for his life, dodging in all directions, and was about to die at the gunpoint. Just then, a forklift was coming towards him from the front. He quickly jumped onto it, and the gangster driver was instantly impaled through the head. Although Jim was fine, the gang leader Jason got out of the car with a pistol in his hand and shot him in the back. The huge impact made Jim lose his balance and fall to the ground immediately. Jason, however, kept approaching Jim, who was unable to escape and could only wait for death unwillingly. Fortunately, passerby promptly sent him to the hospital. After several hours of rescue efforts, the doctors finally removed the bullet from his throat. His wife, upon receiving the news, rushed to the hospital as well. Having lost her son first and now her husband nearly dying, she was on the verge of collapse. Fortunately, Jim survived in the end, but unfortunately, the bullet pierced his vocal cords, and he will never be able to speak again. For Jim, the most painful thing was that his son would never come back to life. Then came the daily repetitive rehabilitation training. Although the process was extremely painful, he still persisted for his son. After a few days of recuperation, it was time for Jim to be discharged from the hospital. There was no smile on his face. When he got home, he could no longer hold back his sadness. His heart felt as if it had been stabbed hard, because every time he came home before, his son would run to him happily. Now all of that would never exist again, and this made him start crying uncontrollably. In the following days, Jim also became listless. Every day, he would lie on his son's bed, feeling his son's presence, as if he had never left him. He felt that his life had lost all meaning and could only numb himself with alcohol. Seeing her husband gradually wasting away, the wife could only give him enough time to adjust. That day, looking at the bicycle, a thought immediately occurred to Jim, and that was revenge. He was determined to make those who had killed his son pay the price, but he knew that the gangsters he was going to face were all extremely vicious, and he had to have enough strength. So he decided to spend a year strengthening himself. In addition to having fighting skills and shooting accuracy, one also needs excellent driving skills. Although the days are monotonous, thinking of his son, his eyes once again became resolute. The sorrowful wife also left him to start a new life, and Jim threw himself even more earnestly into his training. As the day drew nearer, he would come to the gang's hideout at night and start analyzing the personnel situation. The gang leader was his ultimate target. Before leaving, he took pictures of the gang members' license plates, planning to start with this person. At night, he sneaked into the other man's mansion quietly, but Nick sensed something was amiss and was vigilantly patrolling the house. Jim hid behind the wall, and when Nick came close, he hit him hard on the head. Nick fell down the stairs. When he woke up, he was already hanging in the warehouse. To avoid revealing his identity, Jim wore a helmet, and he cut the rope and pulled him to the table. He took out 2 pieces of prepared materials and asked him to write down everything. But upon seeing the content on them, Nick instantly flew into a rage. But Jim held him down and gave him a severe beating. He thought Nick wouldn't resist anymore, but unexpectedly, Nick took the opportunity to launch a surprise attack. After pushing Jim away, he immediately used a dagger to cut the lock on his wrist, then pulled out the dagger again and stabbed Jim's arm hard. Then the two fought again. Although Jim had trained for a year, he had no practical experience, and Nick began to gain the upper hand. But Jim didn't give up and began to unleash his potential. After Jim shook off the other man, he picked up the screwdriver on the ground and stabbed it into his calf. While the other man was in pain, Jim lifted him up and threw him down in the bathroom. Thinking of his son's tragic death, all the anger in his heart erupted at that moment. After a fierce battle, Jim finally killed Nick. Then he armed himself and began to take revenge on the rest of the gangsters. The reason why he chose today was that it was exactly the anniversary of his son's death. Then he dropped Nick off at the door of the sheriff in charge of the case and left a letter saying, "You have something to do tonight." Besides, there was a USB drive. Plug it into the computer and it would record all the criminal information of the gangsters. And each picture was accompanied by the address of the other party, including the notes on that piece of information. While the sheriff was going through the files, Jim had already started his revenge in his car. Just then, he happened to see 2 people being robbed by gangsters, but he didn't act immediately. Instead, he waited until the robbers were about to leave. Then he stepped on the gas and rammed into them hard. Immediately, he pulled out a knife and stabbed them fiercely before they could react. Jim then sped up to try to escape. Unexpectedly, he seized the opportunity to climb onto the car, and no matter how hard Jim tried to shake him off, he couldn't. Then he pulled out a pistol. Jim grabbed his wrist with his other hand and then slammed him against the car, snatching the pistol away. He quickly adjusted himself, then went to the gang's hideout and threw a package inside, which contained the 2 fingers of the man he had just met. This made Jason instantly furious. He thought it was his sworn enemy, so he sent his men with equipment there. Gunshots filled the entire street, and this was exactly what Jim wanted, to let these people hurt each other. At this moment, a female police officer was trapped in the middle. When she tried to withdraw, she was unfortunately shot and fell to the ground. Jim saw this and immediately sped up and rushed over, then began shooting wildly. However, this scene was captured by Tom and sent to Jason. Just then, Jim also saw Tom and immediately sped up and rammed him hard. Tom had no time to dodge and was instantly knocked flying. Jim picked up the phone and handed it to him, then shot Tom in front of Jason. Looking at the figure before him, Jason immediately realized that Jim was the very person he had killed a year ago. He promptly ordered his men to start chasing Jim. Mike received the message and just then saw Jim about to drive away. He immediately gave chase, but they had no idea that Jim was deliberately luring them. After dealing with his 2 subordinates, Jim sped off in his car. When the other party caught up, he accelerated again, ramming the pickup truck in front into the middle of the road. Mike couldn't avoid it in time and crashed right into it. At this point, there was only 1 motorcycle left. Jim quickly drove the vehicle into the narrow passage. Unexpectedly, the other party fired randomly, so he deliberately slowed down the speed. At the moment he was shooting, Jim grabbed the other's arm and then suddenly rammed into the front windshield. Then he pushed him against the wall. Sparks flew from the motorcycle. Due to the loss of balance, he could only hang on to the vehicle. This also marked the end of his life. After a short rest, Jim got on his motorcycle and charged towards the gang's base. Before the gate closed, Jim rushed in and immediately engaged in a fight with the other side, killing several gang members, but he was also cornered. That moment, just saw the oil that had leaked onto the ground. Jim changed his gun and then aimed at the spot where the oil was and fired. While the other party was still in a state of confusion, Jim immediately started shooting to kill. After dealing with the bodyguards outside the door, he went upstairs with his gun and successfully killed several gang members. Reached the top floor and set a few tripwires in the corridor, but while he was looking around, he was suddenly attacked from behind and knocked to the ground. The attacker was Mike, who had survived the earlier encounter. Before Jim could react, Mike picked him up again and threw him hard onto the table. Jim immediately drew his gun and fired, but was lifted up and slammed against the table by the other man, causing his pistol to fall. Facing Mike, at this moment, he had no chance to fight back at all. Just then, a person coming to support triggered the tripwire, and the loud explosion also caught Mike's attention. Jim seized the opportunity to counterattack quickly, and then pulled out the pistol at his waist and fired at him fiercely. Unexpectedly, despite being shot several times, Mike still had the strength to fight back. He picked up Jim and rammed him hard against the fence again. Then the two started a new round of fighting. At this moment, both of them were almost out of strength. Mike picked up his weapon and fired a burst of shots. When the other party ran out of bullets, Jim quickly moved forward to counterattack. This time, he didn't give him any chance. Jim immediately picked up the magazine, then forced the other party into the corner, and then loaded the magazine into the gun, crouched and fired. At this moment, the sheriff, who had received the information, also arrived and began to clear the bodyguards outside the door. After dealing with a few people, he also reached the top floor. Jim, who sensed the commotion, quickly aimed his gun at the sheriff. Although the two drew their guns and faced each other, the sheriff was the first to lower his weapon, because he also understood that the other man, as a father, was merely avenging his son. And besides, these gangsters deserved to be punished. Just then, a burst of bullets suddenly rained down at their feet. The shooter was Jason's female companion. While she was changing the magazine, Jim rushed out, but it was too late. Dozens of bullets were fired in an instant. Fortunately, because Jim was wearing a bulletproof vest, he narrowly escaped. The sheriff on the side wanted to fight back, but as soon as he stuck out a part of his body, he was shot and could only retreat again to avoid it. After exchanging a look, Jim quickly picked up a pistol and then quietly went around to the back to control Jenny. He could have killed her directly, but she pretended to be pitiful at this moment. Remembering that she was also oppressed by Jason, Jim relented and put down his weapon. However, in the next second, Jenny shot Jim without hesitation and then fired several shots at the sheriff. life. Jim, no longer showing mercy, shot her in the back and then killed her with another shot. Struggling to his feet, Jim then made his way to the hall with great difficulty, where Jason had been waiting for a long time. By this time, Jim had no strength left. He raised his pistol with all his might, but the next second, Jason fired at him wildly and he was hit. Just as Jason was about to finish him off, a gunshot rang out from behind. It was the sheriff who had arrived. Jim burst out with an unprecedented strength, threw Jason to the ground, and then punched him in the face one after another. Thinking of the scene of his son's tragic death, Jim tightly choked the other's throat. He collapsed to the ground only after the other party had completely breathed his last. Although revenge had allowed him to vent his hatred, it could not fill the void in his heart. He recalled all the experiences he had shared with his son when he was a father, but now only memories remained. Although this was just a simple action film, his love for his son was like his throat, silent but palpable.